I'm Dr. Erica Bove, and welcome to the Love and Science podcast. I'm your host, and also the founder of Love and Science, Thriving Through Infertility. I'm so excited you're here today. With over a decade of experience helping thousands of women just like you, I empower professional women to build their families with confidence and compassion. Let's dive in. Hello, my loves. Welcome back to the Love and Science podcast. Today, we're going to talk about FSH timing and meaning. Perhaps you've gotten your labs back before, and maybe you're a cardiologist, or maybe you're an engineer, or something very far out on the spokes of the medical subspecialties. And you're like, how do I interpret whether these values are normal? Let me give you a framework for menstrual cycle physiology, as well as how to interpret your values. Okay, so we were taught in medical school that the menstrual cycle is a diagram and it's linear. And there's a follicular phase and there's a luteal phase. And in the middle of that is an LH surge where the egg is ovulated, and then that sort of causes the transition from the follicular phase to the luteal phase. That is only partially true. If I could actually redesign the menstrual cycle diagram, it would be a cylinder, which is a little tricky because we'd have to do it in a three-dimensional way, or maybe make it a circle, and some things would be upside down. I think about this all the time because, my mentor, Dr. Randolph, taught me that it's not like the follicular phase happens out of the blue. The follicular phase sets the stage for the luteal phase, which then sets the stage for the next follicular phase, and so on and so forth. And that concept is going to be really important, not just for this episode, but as we explore menstrual cycle physiology, because truly everything we do in REI goes back to the menstrual cycle in an ideal menstrual cycle. Okay, so what is happening? So when we have a period, what's happening is that we have just had the fall of the luteal phase hormones, the estradiol and the progesterone from the corpus luteum. And when that happens, it causes the breakdown of the uterine lining, which has shed. So that thickened lining is breaking down, it starts to bleed off. And typically when this happens, our hormones are quote unquote at baseline. How do we interpret this? I know that a person is at baseline if their estradiol is less than 50. And in terms of units, that is picograms per ml in the US. In Canada, the units are slightly different. And the progesterone at this time is usually low as well. It is typically less than 1 nanogram per ml, which, if it's less than 1.5, that is also considered low for most people. It just depends on how quickly that corpus luteum is breaking down and the particular assay of the, where the blood is being tested, because there's some variability there as well. But typically, progesterone over 3 suggests that somebody has ovulated. And once it sort of drops below 1.5 to 1, then we can say that person's at baseline. Okay, so when we're thinking about the fact that the estradiol is suppressed, then we look at the FSH, because we know that estradiol and FSH are like a seesaw, right? So when one goes up, the other goes down. When the estradiol is low, as it is naturally in the beginning of the menstrual cycle, that's when the FSH should be unsuppressed, if that makes sense. Otherwise, it can get really confusing. For instance, if we check an FSH in the luteal phase, for instance, then oftentimes the elevated estradiol from the corpus luteum is suppressing the follicle stimulating hormone. So we really can't interpret the values at that point in the cycle. So typically we say that a cycle day 2 through 4, estradiol with FSH is the best way to interpret these values. Now, do we sometimes check on cycle day 5? Sure. But that increases the chances of a follicle being selected, the estrogen coming from that follicle, and then suppressing the FSH. And like I said, if we're trying to see if FSH is too high, we don't want it being falsely suppressed by the estradiol. So, if the estradiol is less than 60 or 65, that's still considered acceptable to interpret the values. But once the estradiol starts to be, over 70 to 80, that's really when we start to see it suppressing the FSH. So drives me bonkers when I will have labs that were ordered by another practitioner where we just have an FSH value. I cannot interpret that value because unless I also have the corresponding estradiol, I don't know if it's being falsely suppressed. Similarly, the same thing with an estradiol. If somebody just checks an estradiol, it's kind of meaningless in a sense because if I don't have the FSH at the same time, that's really what I'm trying to get is like, how hard is the brain working to keep cycles going? And we know that when the FSH is above 10, and in terms of we're talking about international units per liter or milli international units per milliliter. That's the units for FSH. If the FSH is above 10 and definitely above 15, but 10 is when I start to get concerned, that means that the brain, i.e. the pituitary, that's where the FSH is coming from, the anterior pituitary, that part of the body is working really hard to keep the cycles going, which is telling us inherently that the ovaries are likely struggling to do their job. So when we have an estradiol that's less than 50 and an FSH that's maybe like 7 or 8, everything is swimming along. But when we have, say, an estradiol is under 50 and the FSH is 13 or 17 or 25, that's really concerning because we know that there's probably some FSH resistance in the body already going on because the body is like used to seeing so much FSH around, and it's probably going to be harder to induce ovulation if that's a problem in the fertility clinic. It's also going to be harder to develop a large cohort of follicles, especially when the FSH is already so high. So, say I check somebody's day 3 estradiol, and for reference, cycle day 1 is the first day of flow. So where you need a pad or a tampon or whatever you use to collect the menstrual blood. Say I get somebody's day 3 estradiol and their estradiol is 80 or 85 and their FSH is 13, I need to rewind my brain back to, say, a couple days ago before that estrogen started to rise, right? Because we know the estrogen's probably coming from a developing follicle. So say we checked it on like cycle day 1 or maybe even the previous luteal phase before menses started, when the estradiol was actually less than 50, that FSH might have been 18, 20, 22, something like that. And so it's this dynamic process. We can't just look at one snapshot in time. Obviously, if the estradiol is less than 50, it's a lot easier to interpret the FSH. But if a lot of people get falsely reassured, if the day 2, 3, or 4 estradiol is elevated, we know that there's a suppression happening. So even, an FSH of 8 or 9 on that day in the context of an estradiol of 80 or 90, that's going to also make me worried that somebody is starting their follicular recruitment, perhaps even at the end of the luteal phase, which that's one of the reasons that women get shorter cycles, because that maybe somebody ovulates on day 8 or day 10. And then if their luteal phase is conserved, that's going to be, a 22 to 24 day cycle if we do the math. And that's short. And that's one of the signs of ovarian aging, especially if you listen to previous podcast episodes, we talk about this in detail. And so, fertility and ovarian reserve, it's not like a light switch. It's not like all of a sudden we wake up at 35 or 40 or whatever age we throw out and say, okay, the lights are off. This is not happening. It's typically a progression over time, and there is some cycle to cycle variability. So you could even check, an FSH and an estradiol every single month, and you might get different values as well. And so, there is a maxim in our field that is, your fertility or your ovarian reserve values are only as good as the worst day of FSH. And that's what I teach all my trainees, because sure, if your, FSH and your estradiol come back 3 months after your initial one is 45 is your estradiol and your FSH is, 8.5, we'll cheer. Okay, this is good. So it's swimming along, there's no problems. But if a previous FSH was like 19 or 25, that's really important data, because that means that, there is some compensation happening. There's some ovarian aging happening, and it's probably going to show up when we try to stimulate somebody's ovaries. And the ovaries are already used to seeing so much FSH that whether we use clomiphene or letrozole, which work by elevating the endogenous FSH, or if we use exogenous FSH, either in our gonadotropin or IVF cycles, then, our delta, right, like where the FSH is starting to where we're actually going is not going to be as great. And we may only recruit 1 or 2 follicles. And so estrogen priming, for a treatment corollary, that's actually really useful in this scenario, because if we can drive the FSH down in the luteal phase, then we can maybe get a coordinated follicular phase. And if the antral follicle count is say 5, sometimes we can actually get to 4 or 5 follicles, whereas the resistance might have pushed that down before, and we might only get 1 or 2 dominant follicles. And so, looking at it, you have to look at, number one, where in my cycle were these labs obtained? And if you have an app, it's pretty easy. You just calculate the first day of flow and then, extrapolate. Okay, maybe it was day 2, maybe it was day 3. So it's really important to tell your doctor as they're interpreting your labs, like what cycle day you had your blood drawn on. And then also, was my estradiol less than 50, in the US units? And if it was, fantastic, because the FSH is a lot easier to interpret. We want it to be less than 10 under those circumstances. But if you had an elevated day 2, 3, or 4 estradiol, that is not great, because that means that the FSH value that you have is suppressed, and that it was probably higher earlier in your cycle. And so if you do the math, so you can never really extrapolate, but if you do the math, say your FSH is like 9 with an estradiol of 80, you're probably talking about an FSH greater than 10, which by definition is an elevated FSH. And obviously we need to correlate this with the anti-Mullerian hormone, which correlates to response to medications. Also the antral follicle count, because that suggests how many follicles we might get to, best case scenario, in a well-timed and stimulated cycle. But I think that we forget that this is a dynamic process, and that just because we get labs checked on day 2, 3, or 4 of the cycle doesn't mean that the ovaries don't have different plans. So we have to look at both the estradiol and the FSH at the same time. We have to know where we're at in the cycle. And we have to understand, importantly, if the estradiol is over 50, that maybe we check in a different cycle. Maybe that's not representative of, of the most accurate interpretation of the FSH. And if the FSH is on the higher end, there's a very good chance that we're dealing with some elevated FSH and some, ovarian resistance going on, which can be really tough to treat sometimes. So let me know what other questions you have about FSH interpretation. But I think, acknowledging that, one snapshot is not enough. Really, if we get another reassuring value later in time, that's really not going to reassure us overall, but we have to keep that highest FSH in mind. Now, the caveat with that is that occasionally we do, if you look at the menstrual cycle diagram, we do have a small bump in the FSH right around the time of ovulation, but usually it's not going to be like, if the FSH is like 40 or 60, like it's usually not up that high. So, if we have an isolated elevated FSH value and that's all we have, we really do need to get curious about getting all the labs together at the appropriate timing. But I'm never going to feel really good about seeing an isolated FSH value that's super elevated, because that probably means that something deeper is going on. If we can add on labs in real time to an isolated value, that's really wonderful. But if we can't, then, sometimes we just got to do our best to recheck the labs at the appropriate timing, which is annoying, but it's really important. Hopefully this has elucidated why we always need to check the labs together and why the timing is so critical, because, beyond that window of the menstrual cycle, the estrogen is going to be elevated and it's going to be really hard to interpret the other labs. So, you know how much I love you. Until the next time. Bye.